First off, I would like to acknowledge that PyroLife project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovative Program, MSCA ITN 2019, under Grant Agreement 860787. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on our 4th webinar as part of our Living with Fire series, where we share different perspectives on living with fire from throughout Europe. Today, we'll be hearing from Vigdis Vandvik on her presentation titled A Burning Issue, Understanding the Ecological and Evolutionary Imprints of Humans on Biodiversity, Climate, and Coastal Heathlands. But before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to cover some of our housekeeping rules for those unaffiliated with our webinar series. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be shared on the PyroLife website, pyrolife.lessonsonfire.eu, as well as on our YouTube channel and other social media networks. A written summary will be provided and available on our blog in the coming weeks. And if you are using social media, please consider using our hashtag to spread the word, hashtag PyroLife Webinars. We encourage everyone to ask questions throughout our presentation. And as you may have noticed, audio and video are disabled, but please feel free to type in your question at the bottom of the screen in the Q&A chat box so that I can prepare them for the discussion section at the end of our presentation. There'll be plenty of time left after the presentation for questions, so we encourage you all to take the opportunity to engage and learn more from our speaker today. And as today we have listeners from all over the globe, please feel free to leave your questions in your native language and we'll translate them and they'll be addressed at the end of the webinar in English. But before I get in too deep, I'd like to take a second to introduce myself. My name is Mario Tapia. I am the early stage researcher working on project number 3 as part of the PyroLife project. I'm based out of Tecno Silva in Leon, Spain, and my research involves trying to characterize fire behavior in temperate Northwest Europe. Among the aim of my works are to draw comparisons to fire behavior in Southern Europe, particularly that of the, particularly that of the Mediterranean, to assess how drivers to fire behavior are different in these two regions. And without further ado, I'm happy to present our speaker today, Vigdis Vandvik, a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Bergen in Norway. Vigdis is a community ecologist with research interests in how natural and human drivers affect populations, communities, and ecosystems at a variety of different spatial and temporal scales. She's also worked on a number of nature management and conservation authorities to explore the ecological impacts. Her research focuses on the anthropogenic and natural forcings shaping coastal heathlands and how they've changed over the course of millennia. She explores how the tradition of heathland management through low-intensity burning and grazing regimes contributes to biodiversity. But I'm better off letting her explain it. Vigdis, thank you for joining us, and I'll be handing the floor to you to begin your presentation. When you're ready, can you please share your screen?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to PyroLife for the invitation to come here. I'm really both happy and honored to be here. And then I hope that you are now seeing my presentation. Is this correct?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, great. So for many of you, fire is the thing that you study or your response variable in a way. For me, fire is one of the most important environmental drivers of my favorite study system, which is the coastal heathlands of Northwest Europe. And what I'll do today is that I'll take you through a travel through the past and the present and the future of the heathlands. And of course, all the way along, I will discuss how fire and how more specifically human use of fire has both shaped and is also responding to changes and global changes in the heathlands. But before I even start doing that, I would like to introduce, of course, one of the players in this game, which is fire in my heathlands. And just to tell you that fire and heathlands for me is also a personal journey, because I know that many of you are students. And for me, the fire systems of the coastal heathlands was the first thing. My first paid job ever as a biologist was to study fire. And what I did was that I studied how the vegetation and trees in the heathlands responded to fire and also to succession after fire. So this is me as a student, and one of the things that happened to me when I was out there studying heathlands was that I found a moss that I hadn't seen before. And it happened to be a new moss for Norway, which happened to be my first very small publication. And we'll get back to this moss later, but I just want to say that for me, the fires of the heathlands and the heathland ecosystem is something that is sort of started me in science. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is first the heathlands, and I want to talk to you about what coastal heathlands are from a biological perspective, where we can find them and why we find them where we find them. And then I want to talk about the long history of heathlands, understanding how the interplay and between human drivers, so fire and grazing and natural processes, has shaped the systems. I want to talk a little bit about why we should care about heathlands, and then I want to talk about the future. So coastal heathlands, the climate is getting warmer, wetter, and milder, as we say in Western Norway these days, and on the west coast of Europe. What are the impacts for heathlands, and what can we do to conserve them and to make use of them in these in the new future? So starting the first part of my talk about the past, I want to introduce a second player in my scheme here, which is Caluda vulgaris, the heather. And I want to talk a bit about the distribution and the history of coastal heathlands. So this is a picture of a coastal heathland in Blomsøy in Alstahaug in north of Norway. It's an open coastal landscapes with islands and mountains and all the things that you expect from Norway. But you also have these heathland, these sort of unassuming vegetation that you find along the coast. You can go further south to south of Norway, and the landscape looks very much the same. Again, you have these heathlands. In August every year, they flower and they go purple. But for the rest of the year, they look something like this, sort of quite unassuming and not something that looks very impressive, perhaps. On the south coast of Norway, you find the same, again, the same kind of barren landscape. And then you can go all the way down to Cantabria in Spain and you find the same. And this map from the Montancalan shows the distribution of the coastal heathlands along the west coast of Europe, all the way from north of Norway and all the way down to Spain and Portugal. You can also go into the past and find the same. So this is a picture from Denmark in the 1800s. And this knitting man is standing out in the heathlands of Jutland, looking after his sheep. And of course, the animals, the sheep, are part of the picture here. So Hieland is in the eastern part of the heathland region. And the sheep are an important part of the picture. And so they are sort of the reason why the heathlands are here. Because this used to be a wooded landscape in the past. And this is something that when I was a student, we learned, or in the 1980s anyway, they learned, so it was a little bit before my time, I have to say, but they learned that the reason why we had these tree-laced landscapes was because the climate on the west coast was so harsh, so trees couldn't grow there. But if you dig down into the soil, you find all these roots of trees. And so the history of the heathlands is actually something else. Heathlands are systems that exist, and they look the way they do because they are managed by fire. And so this fire management regime you can sort of observe in this picture, which is from just outside Bergen, where we have these quite old heathlands in the foreground. When they get 15 to 20 years, the heather starts to grow old and they start to be invaded by things like trees and junipers and things. They are then burnt, and then you go into a pioneer phase, which looks very much like a grassland. And gradually the heather comes back and the heathland builds up. So you have this cycle of heathland succession that sort of goes around and around. If you don't burn the heathlands, then you get into a degenerate phase, and gradually the forest starts to get back. And then, of course, you can get reforestations. And the reason why we know, or we learned, that heathlands are not natural systems came from paleoecology. And so back in the 80s, Peter Emil Karland was investigating heathlands on the west coast of Norway. And he found a very typical pattern. So he found that, so this is a paleoecological diagram. On the y-axis, you have radiocarbon age, where the youngest places are on the top of the diagram, and then you go down 1,000, 2,000, and all the way down to 5,000 years into the past. And pollen diagrams or counting pollen can enable you to see what kind of vegetation has been in these heathlands. And so what you see here is that until about 4,000 years ago, there was forest on the coast. Then the forest gradually disappeared and Kaluna came in, so the heather. But at the same time, you have this very clear pattern that you have, not only do you have fire, but you have recurring fire. So you have charcoal in the ground that is telling you that there has been recurring fire happening in this landscape over a very long time. The interesting thing that Peter Emil and his colleagues found out was that when they started to date the heathlands on adjacent and very similar looking islands, they found that some of these islands had heathlands that dated back a really long time, 5,000 years, 4,000 years, whereas others were much younger, less than 1,000 years. And the only way you can explain something like this is not by climate or some kind of broad scale environmental driver, but by fine scale drivers, so humans. So that's how they realized that the heathlands are not a purely natural landscape. They are a semi-natural landscapes. They are made by people. And so you might ask, why on earth do people want to burn down their forests and make heathlands? And from a biological point of view, this is a bit of a puzzle, because if you look at the primary productivity, so how much nutrients they could get out of their landscapes, from a deciduous wooded meadow, you can get something somewhere between 600 and 1,200 kilos per acre of biomass per year. Grassland is a little bit less, and heathland is significantly less. But there is another side to the equation as well, because making a heathland makes a really low input. It's a really low input land use regime. You don't have to collect fodder all the time all through the year, because the Kaluna heather is green all through the year and can be eaten in the summer and in the winter. So you can have your animals out for a year. And then you have this system where you have this all year fodder, and if you burn the heather, it promotes the Kaluna at the expense of wood and trees and wood resources. And so there becomes a trade-off. You make this fire managed landscape, then you have a really sort of low input agricultural regime where you can keep your animals out there and get resources from them quite easily. And then of course this whole heathland husbandry frees up a lot of resources. And when people have talked about this, they talk about how it's, the fishing and the fishing farming interactions in the heathlands. But I'm thinking that, there were also other things that the Old Norse were very, very fond of and very famous for. And so maybe this was what they wanted to free up the resources for. Another thing or a point that I want to make here is that I said that these heathlands, they date back sort of 5,000, 6,000 years. And that's quite a long time. So these are really old landscapes. And because they are semi-natural landscapes, they are really old cultural heritage. So the heathlands that date back 6,000 years. And there are other things that we are really proud of and that we think of as ancient, which are really a lot younger. So, talking about this landscape and about this cultural heritage, how does it function? What is the ecological functioning of this landscape? And I now want to introduce a third player in my little game here. So this is the Old Norse sheep. And these are interesting animals. They are unimproved sheep stocks, which haven't really been bred through the 1800s like all our other sheep stocks. So they are small, they are light, they are quite tough and hardy, and they have a lot of the old sort of interesting animal behaviors in them. I'm not going to talk so much about the sheep, but I'm going to talk about what we have learned, sort of studying this system from an ecological and biodiversity perspective. So one of the first things that I did as a researcher, together with Per Orrestad and others, was I was trying to understand what's the impact of grazing and environmental variation on the post-fire successions in heathlands. In other words, what kind of nature or what kind of semi-natural landscape emerges when we burn these heathlands? And we were working out at Ligra outside Bergen, which is one of our main study sites. And one of the things that was very easy to see was that when you burn a heathland, if it's a dry or intermediate or moist heathland, and whether you graze it or not, Kaluna is really quite good at getting back after fire. So after just 5 years, our plots were basically covered in heathlands, or covered in Kaluna. Another more interesting aspect that we were interested in was to try and understand the sort of the biodiversity and plant community responses. And one of the things that we saw here, and then we were studying years since fire and the species composition of plants. And one of the things that we saw that was that if we didn't graze the heathlands, then we had a very nice and tidy succession going on where you would have some vegetation before the fire. And then the first year after fire, it would be very different. Then you would have a grassland. And then it would gradually go back to whatever it was before the fire. So you have this kind of cyclic succession that I was showing a picture of. You can actually also see it in the data from the species composition. The interesting thing for us was that when you graze this system, the tidiness largely disappear. So instead of this nice tidy succession, all of a sudden you have a bit of a mess. Things are going up and down and varying in all kinds of ways. And of course, from a biodiversity point of view, from a plant ecology point of view, mess is quite a good thing. So when you have mess, then you have more niches, more space for more species. We'll get back to that. Another thing that we were investigating, and this is Ingrid Moren, who also works here at Bergen, and she did her PhD on seed banks in heathlands. And one of the things that she studied, so now we also have a sort of years since prescribed burning on the x-axis, and we're looking at on the left-hand side, we're just looking at what happens to the vegetation. And as I showed you before, the Kaluna vegetation really picks up, it comes back after fire. This is a fire-adapted species, so that's not strange. But what we see on the right-hand side surprised us a little bit, because here we have the soil seed bank buildup after fire. And one of the things that you immediately can see is that Kaluna produces ridiculous amounts of seeds. We found up to 30,000 seeds per square meter in our seed bank. So that's much more than any sensible species could possibly need. But what interested us here was the temporal trend. So you see that after 2 years after fire, you have quite a few seeds that germinated from the seed banks. We harvested its seed banks in different times since fire using a chronosequence. And it gradually builds up, which you would expect. But what we didn't expect was this, because in the 2 first years after fire, the Kaluna is gone. There is no Kaluna, there is no seed production. So how come we had such high germination in these early years? And actually, the first thing we did when we saw these numbers was to go back and recount, because this didn't fit what we expected. So where do these extra seeds come from? So the first thing we did, or the second thing we did after realizing that our numbers were actually correct, was that we went out and started reading on the sort of fire literature more globally, plants and fire literature more globally. And we found out that there is a lot of species out there in natural fire regimes, in natural fire systems, that respond to germination, or they germinate easily when they are exposed to smoke. And there is this molecule, carcinolide, that is really usual for species to respond to. So they have this cue that when they get this, they know the fire has been. And if you want to talk about it in sort of a tautological kind of way, which of course we shouldn't, but it's a very good cue for the species, because when there has been a fire, then the landscape is also open and there's a lot of free space. So this is a good time and space to germinate. So this is an evolved response to fire. And so what interested us was this. We know that our heathlands are not natural. They are a human-made system. Could it be that smoke or that these fires have started an evolutionary response in our heathland species to fire? So to investigate this, we went through a lot of the little steps in our research, and I want to run you through them because they illustrate how we as ecologists or plant biologists work with these kinds of questions. And so the first thing we did was, and Joachim Töpper, who was doing this research, we said that, okay, if there is such a response in our system, the first thing that we should see is that if we expose seeds to smoke, they should germinate better. So we did a small experiment where we looked at control seeds, so seeds, and these are from 10 different mother plants, and we just had some seeds that were germinated with water, and we see that after 50, 60 days, these things had germinated. And then we added smoke to the water and we asked, what happens now? And what happens was that these seeds were germinating a lot faster. So what we were seeing is that Calluna knows what smoke is. Calluna seeds, they know what smoke is. When we took fresh seeds from the plants, exposed them to smoke, they germinated faster. This was interesting, but it doesn't mean that this plays any role in the ecological dynamics of the system. So the next thing we did was we said, okay, if this is the case, then we should expect that in old heathlands, so in these mature heaths that I talked about, there's a long time since fire, the seed bank has been building up, there's a lot of seeds in the system that have not, they are naive, they haven't been exposed to fire, to smoke before. So these seeds, they should respond really quickly to fire. But in these newly burned areas, and this is what we saw in our field experiment that I showed you before, in the newly burned areas, of course, the smoke has already been there. So these seeds have been exposed to smoke. So once we give them, once we let them germinate, they should have a smoke light. They should be already primed to a smoke response. So what we did was we did a field experiment or a lab experiment where we took soils from different stages of heathland into the lab. And then we took the newly burned heath where we knew that these seeds had already been exposed to smoke in nature. And we had some control plots and ash and smoke and ash and smoke. So we had different kinds of treatments and all the seeds germinated. There was like they were all the same. There was no variation. But interestingly, when we had our old heath and we did exactly the same treatments, so these were seeds that you will remember that had not been exposed to these kinds of things before. We saw that when we gave them smoke or indeed ash or whatever, when we gave them some kind of clue to say that here there's been a fire here, then they germinated a lot better. And it's also quite interesting to see that the numbers that we achieved sort of up to 20,000-30,000 seeds per square meter are indeed very, very similar to what we found in the recently burned heath before. So this really does suggest that Calluna has a smoke-induced germination, and this smoke-induced germination has some ecological consequences out there in nature. So that's all fine. But what is more interesting question, of course, is to ask if this smoke response that we see in the Calluna, if this was something that the Calluna just had with it, the species just had with it into the system, or if this is something that actually evolved in our prescribed management regime that had been going on for thousands of years. So is this an evolutionary response to a human impact? That would be kind of interesting because that's not something that anybody had demonstrated before. So as a starting point, there's a lot of reasons why. Let's see, I just want to hide this video. No. Sorry about that. I wanted to hide the fleeting meeting control. That was what I wanted. So, we wanted to sort of the first thing we could ask ourselves then is, should it have, is this a species that we could expect to have a fast evolutionary response? And there's a lot of reasons why we should think that, because Calluna, it produces a lot of seeds. It has these really massive seed banks. It has very high seed recruitment. And also because of these fire regimes, we have quite short generation times. So this is something as an ecologist, this sort of sets the stage for fast evolutionary responses. The next thing that we need in order to test if evolutionary response has happened is some kind of system or some kind of contrast to help us identify the effect and response. And here we have this really interesting natural experiment where the pink areas are the distribution of Calluna, and on the other map we have, the pink areas are the distribution of the heathlands, and on the other map we have the distribution of Calluna. So you see that while Nigel Webb said that the ecology of Calluna is to a large extent the ecology of the European heathlands, that's sort of true when seen from the UK. But if you saw this whole thing from Finland, for example, that would be quite a different story. So there are large areas where Calluna is not exposed to these fire regimes. And so what we did was that we used this as a natural experiment So we said we identified areas along the coast of Norway where we had a long history based on paleoecological reconstructions of fire. And so all these purple triangles are areas that have been burnt previously. And we can see that from different kinds of paleoecological reconstructions. I just have one here to exemplify, but from all these places we have these reconstructions. Similarly, we have reconstructions from inland Norway, and their fire is a rare happening, simply because we live in a quite northern and quite humid climate. So fire doesn't happen very often. And then we sampled Kaluna seeds from up along the coast in the black dots, and also so from a climate gradient going from the relatively warm to the colder areas way up in the north. And then we also found a similar gradient going from the coast to the inlands. So now we have a really nice system where we have two climate gradients. One of them is within the fire regime, or the coastal heathland fire regime, and the other one is outside. And the question is, how do these respond to fire? And so, to make a long story short, what we did was that we exposed all these seeds to fire, just like we did in a small trial experiment. And in each of these graphs, we are in a different location along the coastal gradient is on the left-hand side, and the alpine gradient is on the right-hand side. And the red seeds are those that are exposed to smoke or fire, and the black lines are the seeds that are not. And what we see is that as we go from the coast and towards the inland, the smoke response gradually disappears. So it means that the inland seeds, they don't know what fire is. They don't know how to respond to a fire clue. But when you go up along the coast, sort of when you're in the coastal localities, you can go all the way up the coast and you still have this smoke response. So to us, that says that fire, the coastal populations know what fire is, the alpine ones don't. And the most likely explanation for this is that the human-mediated fire regime has driven this evolutionary response in the plants. And right now, we are working with other researchers. So, for example, Walter Durka, who is doing a big experiment or a big study of the genetics of Kaluna. And what is really interesting to us here, so all these dots are different populations, and the colors tells us which ones are most closely related to each other. And what is really interesting to us here is that all the Kaluna along the west coast of Norway or of Europe are related to each other, going all the way up to the west coast of Norway. So this suggests that the coastal heathlands in the fire-prone coastal areas of Europe are really sort of have something special. There is something special to them. And we also did, we've done a small pilot study that we haven't really continued so much on yet, but one of my students, Sigrid, she investigated if this was just Kaluna or if it was also other things. So she investigated a number of species, and for the majority of them, she found that the coastal heathland populations, they are really able to differentiate the fire. So she compared coastal and inland populations. The coastal ones are the red ones, and the inland ones are the blue ones for different species. And she found that the coastal heathlands respond to fire or respond to smoke, whereas the inland populations really do not. So she tested a number of species and found that these fire responses were quite prevalent, and they were always stronger on the coast than in the inland. So again, this suggests that this is not just a Kaluna thing, but the whole community has responded to this. And I'm not going to go much into detail on this. I'm just going to say that this is quite interesting to us, because what it means is that human fire regime has really had some evolutionary consequences in Western Europe. And of course, people have impacted fire regimes for quite long time scales. Here we're talking just about a few thousand years. But when you look at the broader scale of things, we have impacted the frequency of fires on Earth for about 1 million years, the seasonality of fires for about 100,000 years, and then really sort of the landscape level connectivity of fuels and distribution of habitats, like I was showing for Western Europe, for at least the last 10,000 years. Okay, so. Changing gears a little bit here, and here's another player in my game. So this is Norwegian. So if coastal heathlands are not natural, why should we care about them? And this is a question that we as ecologists get a lot. People want to conserve nature, they want to conserve natural systems. So if they are impacted by humans, some people will say that somehow they're not so valuable. And this is from the Ipas global report, looking at we look at human impacts as drivers of loss, as drivers of change in ecosystems. And so in the middle here, for example, you have a lot of different direct drivers, and these direct drivers have some negative consequences on biodiversity in different ways. But the paradox is this: land use, and the purple part here is land use, is identified as one of the major, or the major threat to biodiversity and habitats worldwide. But at the same time, semi-natural habitats like the heathlands and their biodiversity are threatened because these traditional extensive land use practices, like prescribed burning, for example, are disappearing. So humans exist on both sides of the coin here. We are a threat, but our abandonment of land use can also be a threat. And so one of the things that I wanted to investigate more after finding out these things out was to what extent does fire result in biotic is fire a bad thing? So to what extent does fire result in homogenization and loss of interesting native biodiversity in our coastal heathlands? And so we studied this all along the coast of Norway, and Liv Guri Velle did her PhD on this work. And one of the things that she found, and this is not a very nice graph, but one of the things that she found was that species that decrease after fire, they tend to be species that are found in many vegetation zones. They tend to be quite common. Whereas species that increase after fire, so the fire specialists in our system, they tend to have a narrower distribution and also have more demanding environmental requirement. So in short, what she found was that the fire stimulated was more diverse. The fire stimulated flora was more diverse. It also had narrower geographic ranges and higher pH demands. And so these are not just rudderlists or sort of uninteresting species. These are important parts. The post-fire vegetation is important parts of the native biodiversity. And so there's a lot of things that you can say about the conservation value of heathlands. You can say they are old cultural landscapes, like I showed you, 6,000 years, so that has cultural value. They also are a threatened habitat in Norway and in Europe, and they have a lot of species and genetic variation that are of interest to us. They are home to a quite impressive diversity of animals and plants. And then, of course, these sheep that I talked about are interesting, but we also have old breeds of other animals that are interesting to us. And so our research, the research that we did, actually had some very clear implications for how the Norwegian biodiversity or authorities are dealing with heathlands. So on the bottom here is just the logo of the Norwegian Biodiversity Information Center. And what they do is that they map nature, they classify nature, they make red lists of rare and threatened species, they make red lists of rare and threatened habitats, and they also make lists of alien species. And so what happened was that most that I found turned out to be quite rare, so it wasn't so strange that nobody had found it before. So this moss ended up on the red list. So then we've taken on the red list of species. Our research, it also led to coastal heathlands being deemed a distinct vegetation type and something different from boreal heath because of the fire regime and because of the response to the fire regime. So all of a sudden we had a new nature type that was determined and distinguished because of our research. And of course, when you have a red listed species and when this habitat also become red listed because it turned out that it was quite rare, then all of a sudden this affects the alien species assessments in Norway, because when alien species threatens red listed species and red listed habitats, then they are deemed as a larger problem. So in a way, the research that we did really had some implications about how heathlands and their species made it into various kinds of listings in Norway. Of course, also farmers like to hear about this. They like to hear about their heritage and the fact that the landscape that their predecessors created has biodiversity value, it has cultural value, and it also can have some value in the future. Yeah, and of course, it's also good for student projects to be able to tell stories about these old landscapes. So the last thing I want to talk about is, and here is a new player, the climate. So I want to talk about the coastal heathlands in a warmer, wetter future, and what we are now doing to conserve them and what we should do to deal with them. And so, first of all, for Norwegian climate station data confirms that the warming is indeed happening faster here in the north than in other places. So our climate is becoming markedly warmer. We also get more precipitation according to the predictions. But, and here's the interesting part, if you look at this graph, what you can see is that what's really changing is the variability in rainfall. So you're getting much more precipitation in some years, but you also get some wet years. And in fact, if you look back at some of these years, for example, in 2014, we had a 100-year drought, a really, really dry period in Western Norway. It rained less in Western Norway than it did in Sahara during January of that year. It was a very wet year in Sahara, but you get the picture. We want to do some research on the impact of this drought. And one of the things that we got as a feedback was that, well, this was a 100-year drought. It's not going to happen again. So why should we be interested? But of course, in 2018, it happened again. And this sort of illustrates sort of the fact that these extremes are becoming more common. And that also has some implications for the biology and for the ecology of these systems, but also for people. 2018, with a big drought, was a very busy year for firefighters in Western Norway. This was expensive. It was a lot of work. They fought wildfires every day in Norway in July. And this is not normal. This is not something that we expect. And there was a lot of press about it. People were really worried. When we went out in the summer of 2014, after the first round of droughts, one of the things that surprised us was not necessarily the fires, but it was stuff like this. So there was a lot of heather, but there was also a lot of dead heather. So there was a lot of drought damage that we could see in these heathlands. And so Liv Guri Velle, together with some fire researcher, Torgrim Låg and others, she did a quite interesting small study where she just looked at what's the fire behavior of live versus dead heather. And so she looked, this is just sort of time on the x-axis and what happens to the water content of the heather on the y-axis. And the point is that the heather twigs, they dry out at a constant rate. But when they're dead, they dry out a lot faster. And what this means is that all these dead heathlands that we were seeing, one thing is that it wasn't very good for the heath to be dead, or for the species who were eating the heath to be dead. But it also meant that the fire risk on the landscape was completely changed. After just about 2 days, you had the moisture content of less than 20%. So you had this basically the same as firewood. So you would have these fire bombs on the landscape. But we noticed one thing more when we were out there, and that was that not all the heather was dead. So in this picture, you see a line going up the middle. On the right-hand side, everything is dead. On the left-hand side, it isn't. And what we know is that this happens to be a prescribed fire front from some years earlier. So the young heath, the young successional heath on the left-hand side survived, but the dead heath died. And we saw this again and again. And this led us to propose a research project where we would look into sort of the environmental impacts and the nature and the societal impacts of these differences in land use change. So how does a landscape in different land use stages respond to fire? I'm not going to go into much detail about that, but I'm just going to show you one result. So one of the things that we did in this study was that we exposed heath of different ages to droughts of different intensities. And the question was, of course, does the old heath tolerate fire less successfully than the young heath? And this is what we found. So on the x-axis here, you have young heath, building heath, and mature heath. And on the left-hand side, you have the plant traits. So how is the leaf dry matter content of the plants responding to fire? And then you have 3 different levels of fire or drought. So the 3 drops, 2 drops, and 1 drop. So you have 3 different levels of drought going from left to right within each of these ages. On the right-hand side, you see the soil carbon stocks. And one of the things that we found was that in the young heath, nothing responded to drought. So the system didn't really respond to drought. But as the heathland got older, it started to be less and less resilient. So it was more and more stressed. So the plants started to suffer, as you can see on the left-hand plot, and the soil carbon also started to decrease in response to these drought treatments. And so what this means is that, as we observed and also as we found in our experiments, it means that old successional heath is actually it's not so resistant to drought, so it suffers more under a drought, and then you get these dead heather and fire bombs on the landscapes. So the question what we were asking ourselves then is if prescribed burning, so maintaining these heathlands by fire, can actually be a quite nice way to, or a nature-based solution to control wildfire risk, because we cannot control the droughts, we cannot control the climate, but maybe we can control the fire risk. And so this is sort of equivalent to how you think about sort of multifunctionality in an agricultural context, where monocultures they can produce a lot of crops, and there's a lot of other things that you don't get from a monoculture. And then you can compare that to another kind of agriculture where you can produce a lot of where you have a more multifunctionality aspect. You can produce your crops, but you at the same time sustain biodiversity, for example, and help carbon sequestration. Now, fire and fire risk is not on this landscape, on this plot, but maybe it should be. Yeah, so wrapping up in the even longer term, and now going back thousands of years again, we have been in a period where the global fire risk has been decreasing due to climate change, due to long-term global cooling, until about the Little Ice Age. And then on the global scale, we had a period where we were lighting fire all along as we were clearing land and invading new areas on Earth. In the last decades, we've been in an age of fire suppression. And what we are finding is that suppressing fire in these landscapes where fire is a natural phenomenon. So again, going back to this, sometimes human impact is a bad thing, and sometimes the cessation of human impacts can also be a bad thing. So by leaving or by stopping fires on the landscapes that are adapted to them, we are actually introducing some new problems. So I hope that I've convinced you that heathlands are nice, but they are also old anthropogenic landscapes that have high and diverse values, both in terms of culture, biodiversity, and ecosystem functions and services. And to understand these systems, we need to consider the interplay between these long-term human impacts and the natural processes that are operating. And the manageability of heathlands, they are so easily managed by fire and grazing, and that really affects their ecosystem functioning. That can be both a curse, but also an opportunity, because that can help us to safeguard heathlands against new threats, for example, due to climate change. But it can also help us to repurpose them for new societal needs. So, for example, when there is a fire threatening, you would rather be surrounded by well-managed heaths and by safe landscapes where wildfire risk is low, than by landscapes such as this, where wildfire risk is higher. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you guys for listening, and then my funders and students and collaborators and everybody who contributed to this. Thank you.
Vigdis, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I really appreciated your ecological perspective on the semi-natural status of the heathlands. It's something I never really considered. Another thing I thought was really fascinating was the rapid drying capabilities of Kelowna, which you mentioned that can cause sub-zero fires that occur in sub-zero temperatures, which I still have trouble understanding and comprehending.
Yeah. Yeah, we were also quite surprised, but this was another setting where we got out there in the landscapes, we saw these things, and then we started to investigate it together with fire researchers from the Agricultural University here in Western Norway. Yeah,
well, we have several questions that have been submitted by the audience, and as a reminder, if you have questions that have not been yet submitted, just throw it in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get as many questions as time allows. Our first question comes from Simona, who says, thank you for the great presentation, really cool topic. Does the intensity of the fire or fire regime that the seeds are exposed to matter in their response? And what kind of wildfire do the heathlands normally or historically experience?
Yeah, so the wildfire, starting with the last things first, the wildfire regime is almost non-existent. So we have a very, very moist climate here, and in Western Norway, and the soggy landscapes don't burn easily. So the majority of the fires that this system has been exposed to are these human-mediated fires, and they have been made. They've been happening through, as I said, through 6,000 years, and the farmers have a lot of experience also, and also quite strict requirements for how to light these fires. They like to burn them in the winter. They like to burn them when the vegetation is dry but not that dry, and they want to make sure that they burn the vegetation, not the soil. So there's a lot of sort of knowledge going into that. Mm-hmm. So with our species, we know that they respond to chemical fire cues. So this karikinoly, this is a chemical substance that is made, whatever burns, you will make this. And it's soluble in water, and so it sort of seeps into the water and affects this, and into the soil and affects the soil seed bank that way. We haven't actually looked into temperatures, fire temperature, and how that might affect seeds. We know that in many systems, species also respond to temperature cues. But we don't know that for our system because we haven't checked. So we only know about this chemical response.
Okay. And our next question comes from Kathleen. Really interesting and elegant studies. Thank you so much for sharing so clearly. In California, there is often concern after high intensity fires that invasive species resprout more quickly and outcompete native biodiversity. Is that a concern in coastal heathlands, especially with climate change?
Absolutely, and as a twist to that, actually, Sitka spruce is one of the species that are really bad invasive. So they are a North American species. So they are really bad invasives here. So invasives are, of course, all about exchanging species, and that is a big concern here. So how we deal with that is that we try to make sure that when we maintain systems by fire, we will also have a grazing regime. So there will be a grazing regime and there will be some kind of management on the land. So just burning it and then leaving it be, and especially climate change is one thing, but nitrogen pollution is another that facilitates alien species invading in this system because the heathlands is also a nutrient poor system. So it's not enough to just maintain the fire regime. And I think also it's interesting because the traditional fire regime isn't necessarily exactly what we need now, because with higher productivity, higher temperatures, etc., we might need to burn more often in order to maintain the heathlands, and we also need to look out for all these things. So we need sort of a nature management that partly sort of maintains the fire regimes and maintains the systems, but also watches out for new threats.
Okay, and our next question is from Nuria, who comments, great presentation. Since coastal populations show a better response to fire, can they be considered fire dependent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I sort of think so, because what will happen over a longer time is that if you don't burn, then you will start to have invasion by trees and by all kinds of things, and then the heathland, the heathers will be outshaded. And so it's hard. They will not be excluded from the landscape as such without fire, but their abundance will decrease dramatically. So I think they have at least evolved traits that have made them a fire responsive and a fire stimulated species. And I think those ecotypes that we have on the coast, like I also showed from the genetic study, I think we can call them a fire dependent system. And that is also what because in this whole sort of work with the conservation authorities, which I could have talked a lot more about, I think it's quite interesting, but they thought the reason why they decided to split Norwegian heathlands into two major systems, the coastal heathland system that was fire dependent and alpine boreal system that was not, was partly dependent on the research that we found and these genetic responses that we found, because they said, well, then these systems actually do have unique biodiversity. They do have unique traits, unique responses, things that aren't found in the other systems. So they classify them as unique. And as I said, that had all kinds of repercussions for management and for conservation and for regulatory frameworks and how they hit the heathlands. So it's quite interesting to see that, you know, you can germinate some seeds and then it actually has impact.
Right. And our next question is from Bruce, who says, "Hi from Scotland, great presentation. What is the oldest written record of fire management in Norway? In Scotland, the first law, 1424.
Interesting. The true answer is I have no idea. So we don't have very many written sources about this, but what we do have is names. So we have a lot of place names which are very clearly linked to heathers. So, like for example, one of the I didn't point to it, but one of the oldest on the map that I showed you, the 6,000-year-old heathland on the island, that heathland is called Lyngoksen, so the heather ox. So the place names suggest that these things are old, but we don't actually have very many written sources.
Okay.
I should look up the sagas. That's what I should do.
Our next question is from Judith. Really interesting presentation. Thank you. Do you know what the main causes of fire in Norway are today? Is it fire escaping during prescribed burns or different causes?
So fire escaping during prescribed burns is actually really rare. And that's also a huge and quite interesting topic, because when we coastal heathlands in Norway are threatened, they're on the red list as a critically endangered habitat. And the reason for that is lack of management. And so a few decades ago, like in the 90s, 80s, 90s, so until World War II, heathland management was sort of more or less sustained. And so this is one of the regions in Norway where, in Europe where this management has been sustained traditionally for the longest time. So we have a lot of memory, or we have a lot of sort of this sort of documentation of the land use system. And then it started to disappear. And then the fire regime there was like very, very little maintenance of it. In the meantime, firefighters, of course, they learned, and how the fire service works is that they don't like fire. They want to put out all fires, and they don't fully realize that fire is also a natural process. I mean, very many ecosystems burn. And so when you do complete fire suppression, then you get into these problems of biomass buildup and all these things that you guys know a lot about. And so what has happened over the last few years, which was my point here, was that gradually the firefighters, or the professional firefighters, have come to see that the heathland farming community actually have a lot of experience with how to deal with fire and how to manage fire on the landscape base. And they do it much less sort of intrusively and much cheaper than the fire service themselves would do. So instead of going in with helicopter and water and all these things, they will make the fire gates in the landscape, not with tractors, but with burning fire gates and making heathlands beforehand. So they sort of manage the landscape to tolerate fire. So the heathland, so gradually the firefighters and the firefighter sort of authorities have come to realize that collaborating with the heathland farmers instead of sort of doing it in the very sort of big, heavy modern way is actually a better way to maintain better regulations on the landscape. And so we are collaborating now with the National Security Authority and with a lot of different authorities on sort of thinking differently about fire on the landscape. So the fires that we have here will be the big wildfires that we get during those droughts and things. A lot of them are related to different kind of human sort of starters, like electricity cables or stupid people or a glass bottle lying out there or stuff like that. And of course, there is also lightning. But the majority are human started, but not by prescribed fire.
All right. And our next question is from Miriam, who asks, and how far does it play a role? I think she assumes fire, and that so many coastal areas are very popular for recreational use. Heights, that must have changed the management a lot in these areas.
Yeah, this is a really good point, and that's sort of, there is this sort of ignorance creep way of thinking about things, because when we actually surveyed people in Norway and asked them what kind of landscapes do you like, what do you want our nature to look like, and it was quite interesting because people on the west coast have a much stronger affinity for open landscapes than people in the inlands. So these are sort of the landscapes that we expect to see, these open coastal areas. At the same time, people like to build cabins and to do all these things in the landscapes, and they don't like people to be burning around their cabin. And so they don't fully see that the landscape that they like is a result of the prescribed fires that they don't understand why we need to have. So, and then of course you get these successions, and then you get all these very sort of wildfire-prone vegetation close to cabins and things. And yeah, and so you get this, and then they start to clear this, and so you get this situation where, because we don't understand the system, we go out there to experience it and to have sort of be in it, but we don't like the way that it needs to function to be there. So there are some interesting conflicts there.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for today. If there are any more questions coming in, please send them to us and we'll relay them on to Vigdis, and we'll get back to you. Just to sum, thank you everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you to you, Vigdis, for sharing us your insight on the ecology and the history of the coastal heathlands. I found it really insightful for my own research, and I'm really interested in looking at more specifically for the sub-zero temperature and rapid drying capabilities of Kelowna. Before I conclude, I would like to say that our next week, I mean, not next week, approximately next month, we will have our next speaker, our speakers who will, we've got 3 speakers coming up on our next meeting on June 30th. We've got Shauna Legarza, Director of Emergency Management at La Plata County. Sam Marouk, retired State Fire Management Officer of California. And we've got Sasha Berleman, a PhD and Director of Fire Forward at the nonprofit Nature Conservation Organization at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And with that, I would just like to say one final thank you to Vigdis for your great presentation. And I'd like to thank the audience and everyone for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.